Do you ever find yourself overthinking your quilts? I definitely do. If you haven't met me, I'm Kristen, and this is Scrap Fabric Love. And I definitely stress, overthink, contemplate my quilts a lot. In fact, sometimes I even stress about how much I'm stressing about my quilts.
And I know I'm not the only one. I get emails from subscribers, I get messages inside Scrap Club, quilters who say they're overthinking every choice and then second guessing themselves for caring so much. So thinking that the overthinking means they're doing it wrong. And this video isn't tips for how to stop caring about your quilts. Caring is good. It's great, actually, especially if it's caring based on your own tastes and your own curiosity and your own preferences about your quilts. When it's not great is when it's based on someone else's rules or fear of their judgment.
And here's the thing, I teach no stress scrap quilts. I say it on this channel all the time. I know I say it in Scrap Club, and I'm all about let's not stress, let's just have fun with our fabric. But does that mean no stress ever happens in my sewing room? Absolutely not. If you are not new to the channel and you've watched me before, chances are you'll have seen an example of me overthinking, stressing about my quilts. In my most recent quilt along, I was stressing over 4 different shades of purple for a quilt for my mother-in-law. And I know that there are tons of other examples from my other videos. So what gives? Am I just a hypocrite? I'm just telling you guys, don't stress, have fun sewing, and then I go around stressing all the time? Well, maybe I am, but I actually think there are nuances when it comes to quilting stress. And so what I want to talk about today is the 2 flavors of quilting stress that I recognize in my own sewing room. So the good kind that kind of fuels creativity and can give you comfort even, and the bad kind, the kind that probably you're most familiar with that comes from judgment and fear of not being good enough, the kind that like steals your joy and might even stop you sewing. Because none of us is immune to that negative quilting stress or negative thoughts or whatever you want to call that. What I want to give you by the end of the video is a way of thinking about the overthinking in your sewing room. Maybe having some buckets to put that into, whether it's good overthinking or not so helpful overthinking, and a way to decide when it is serving you and when it isn't. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a story about me, see if you relate, right? So I have this channel. I show you quilts that I make. I tell you not to stress about them. I don't follow a lot of quilting rules. That's very true.
I even have a whole other video about all the quilting rules I don't follow.
And most of the time, I don't stress about that. But because I'm putting it on YouTube, I do sometimes stress about that. I've been quilting for 5 years. So I stress about the people who've been quilting for 35 years and what they're going to think about it. And that's my version of the quilt police, right? So these mythical people who might be watching the channel who have learned a certain way and are going to disagree with how I'm doing it. And sometimes they do show up in the comments and they're real people, and sometimes they don't. And that is true for a lot of other quilters on like a smaller scale. So not on YouTube, but like in your life, you're making a quilt for whatever you're making it for a gift or maybe to put in a local quilt show or whatever. And you will make up in your head these things that these mythical people may or may not say when they see it. And the thing is that sometimes those judgments do exist in the real world, right? So there are people who say nasty things or think nasty things. And that's why we have all these ideas in our head about what things should be like, have to be like, whatever. And when it gets to a certain point, it doesn't even matter whether you're ever going to encounter any of the real people because you have internalized their voices in your head and you're doing all the judging for them. So I have a Scrap Club. It's a Patreon group. We meet on Zoom. And it's meant to be like a no judgment, beginner-friendly quilting space. But even in that space, I have folk who know that's what I think about it. Send me quilt blocks for our group quilt, and there will be a note in there that apologizes for it and says tells me exactly what's wrong with it, tells me that they know there's something wrong with it, and in my opinion, usually there isn't anything wrong with it, but anyway, in their heads there is, and they feel like they need to say it to me before I think it of them. And the truth is that I wouldn't have thought it.
Because the truth is we all judge ourselves so much more harshly than anyone else ever judges us.
And when they tell me that, I'm still not judging the block. I'm wanting to give them a hug, right? Because I'm thinking, oh no, what made you feel that way about your quilting? When I hear members of my scrap club, or anyone really, talking about their quilts in that way, in a way that clearly is from this, I don't want to be judged. I think I'm not good enough. I have compared myself to someone else somewhere, and I don't think I measure up. That makes me sad. And that is part of why I show my process on YouTube, and I show you me doing things slightly differently. But this is where I'm a hypocrite, right? Because I will absolutely say the same things to myself about my own quilts, especially when I'm making them for somebody else and it's going to be a gift. I can totally get in my head about all of that. And even in my videos, sometimes you're going to hear me preempting the objections that I think these really experienced mythical quilters are going to have, and maybe speaking to that and explaining why I've chosen something else. And so I feel those things and I think those things, but I try my best to park them, get past them, and do it anyway, because I know that those feelings aren't helpful.
I am a firm believer that we all get to develop our own quilting goals. We don't all have to want to have perfectly matched points. We don't all have to have perfectly spaced quilting lines. But if you follow any kind of quilting social media, you are no doubt going to have those times where you see how somebody else did something, either how precisely they did it or how creatively they did it or whatever. And you're going to have those thoughts that if only I could be a bit more like them, my quilts would be better.
And it can be very hard to parse out which of those is a real thing that could be improved about my quilt and which is just a I'm not good enough, imposter syndrome kind of a thing. And that's the kind of quilt stress obviously none of us needs, because that's the stuff that will freeze you up and make you not want to get into your sewing room and just think I'll never be good enough.
That old maxim about comparison being the thief of joy is 100% true. There will always be someone who makes a quilt that you think is prettier or nicer than your own. But you know what they can't make? They can't make the quilt you could make. And that was what I was trying to show you guys with the last quilt along we did. We all did the same pattern, but because we all had different scraps and we were just using up what we had, there was no way we could ever make the same quilt as each other. And all of our quilts were gorgeous and different and totally our own.
So that's the negative stuff. And we all know that we should try not to let those voices invade our heads. And it's really hard not to. But the other thing that it's hard not to do is to beat yourself up for hearing the voices in the first place. So you sort of start stressing that you are stressing. So you might be getting some messages over here about how perfect your quilts need to be. And then you might be getting other messages over here, maybe some of them from me, telling you that you shouldn't be stressing about your quilt. And then it's all just stress about like you're not good enough at not stressing and you're not good enough at your quilts. And that's just tiring. And that is just not going to make you want to sew, right? So what I want to do is separate at least this bit that's about you shouldn't be stressing ever. I can't take away the internalized messages you might have gotten from somewhere else. I can try and dull them for you. I can try and help you turn down the volume, but I can't really control what's in your head. But what I want to help you with is not stressing about stressing, okay? So sometimes quilt stress is good. Here's when I think that's true. So I think stressing about my quilts, whether that's what fabric to use, whether or not the quilting lines are coming out the way I want, whether I put enough negative space around it, what color I'm going to do the binding, any of that, if I'm spending time thinking about that instead of stressing about something going on in the world that I can't control, then I consider that a good thing. So, for example, I came to quilting in the first place because of COVID. We all remember it. It was a scary time, especially at the beginning. We didn't know what was going to happen. I had really little kids. I was worried for them. I was worried for what the world was going to look like after. I was stuck at home with everybody. You know, I needed a place that was mine where I could control things. So I had a sewing machine and I'd been sort of interested in quilts in the past, and I'd used my sewing machine for various upcycling projects before, but I'd never really gotten into sewing. But I found myself just watching lots of YouTube videos, listening to quilting podcasts, and just immersing myself in learning this new thing that I didn't know how to do. And that gave me a focus. It gave me somewhere where I could control things. I could take bits of fabric, put them together, and end up with a quilt. I could give it as a gift. I could snuggle it. I've created something that wasn't there before. And that gave such a sense of, comfort and achievement and control that I wasn't having in that sort of COVID lockdown horrible bubble. And of course, those kind of stressors that we can't control don't just happen when there's a worldwide pandemic. There's lots of terrible things happening in the world right now that we don't feel like we can control. And so doing something creative like quilting can be a really good way to just keep yourself sane, frankly. Like, it's much healthier than drinking or overeating or overspending or whatever other activities might give you that sense of control. So knowing that that's the world we're living in, I absolutely give myself permission to stress about which fabrics to put next to which and anything else about my quilt that I want to. If I want to spend hours thinking about that, at least that's a problem that I can solve. And I personally think that's a healthier place to put that stress for myself. And of course, the flip side of that is that it's also gives you all those positive benefits from creative self-expression. So you're using the colors you want to use. You're deciding what looks good to your eye next to each other. And in the end, you're creating something that expresses you. And that feels good. And it's okay to let yourself stress along that process, as long as what you're focusing on is your own judgment and your own likes and not some made up set of rules or expectations that you've gotten from somewhere else. And of course, if you're making a quilt purposefully as a gift for someone, it's okay to care what it looks like. It's okay to care if they're going to like it. I would urge you not to be worrying about whether another quilter will like it, especially when you haven't met, that's in your head, that's an amalgam of a whole bunch of other nasty people. But it's okay to worry whether or not you've used enough of their favorite color or it's going to be cozy and comfy enough for them to snuggle with. I would hope you won't be worrying about one or two skip stitches, but that's the journey you have to go on yourself. Obviously, back in the day, making quilts was a utilitarian thing, right? Like they used to have worn out clothes or whatever, cut them up and turn them into a functional blanket that kept you warm. Now, some of us still like using some upcycled materials, but we also, a lot of us use quilting cotton, don't we? And so that's a case of cutting up fabric that's perfectly fine as it is and then putting it back together. So if we didn't care what it ended up looking like after that process, that would be an extremely strange hobby. So it's okay for us to spend time thinking about what colors we want next to each other and how we want it to look. That is just part of the human need to create and express and make something that wasn't here before. And obviously there's a balance. So I probably stress most when I'm making quilts for other people. So for example, I stressed a lot when I was making this quilt for my Uncle Keith. He is an artist. He has been a professional artist, like a painter, that makes money from his art for well over 30 years. And while I was making this video, I was stressing about whether he was going to think my quilt was, artistic enough, because he'd given me a very strange brief. If you haven't seen that series, you can go and watch it and see what the brief was. But I was also stressing because I had an actual literal judgy person trolling me through that whole video series, telling me that I wasn't an artist and that my quilt was ugly and all of these horrible things.
And of course, it hurts when you get actual comments from actual people who are like embodying the quilt police. It doesn't help with that internal struggle of turning down the volume on all of that. But what I do when that happens is I get on the phone to my sister and she reminds me of the thing that I've already said, that we all think about ourselves more than we think about other people. So if somebody is vocalizing some sort of judgment of me, there's something about them in that. So maybe that person felt like they had to follow all the rules their whole life and they see me breaking them and they're a bit resentful. They wanted to be able to do what they wanted to do. If they can't, maybe I shouldn't be able to either. Who knows? That's another story I'm making up, but it's a better story than the one that says, I'm terrible, my quilts are crap, and I should just stop.
But even if that person hadn't been real, and obviously that's a YouTube problem, you hopefully don't have that problem in your sewing room. In order to actually get the quilt finished and give it to him as I'd promised, I had to just let go of that fear. I needed to figure out how to use the bits of that stress that made the quilt better. So it helped me to make choices between where to put different panels or different sections of that quilt, and not use the bit that made me go, I can't give it to him. It's never going to be good enough. I just won't finish it, and I'll just tell him I can't do it. Because that's the alternative, right? And that's the place I don't want you to get to. And my Uncle Keith's quilt was an extreme example, but I do get that way about quilts that I'm going to gift to other people. If you are a longtime viewer, that is probably where you're going to see me stressing the most on my videos, is when it's for a special person. And each and every time that stress comes up for me, I do have to tell myself, they don't quilt. They're going to appreciate the effort. They're not going to be looking at all those details. And you just have to make it good enough for you, as in me, right? And so I will make changes to the point that I'm happy with it. So for example, for Christine's quilt, that was the subscriber in Australia who sent me her fabric because she's ill with cancer. So obviously I wanted that quilt to be special. And so when the quilting lines didn't turn out the way that I wanted them to, I did unpick some. And I told you guys about it on the channel. And I also told you about how I had to stop myself and realize that Christine knew that I don't make perfect quilts, and she wasn't expecting it to be perfect. And so I just made it as good as I could make it, and I gave it to her. You know, because the alternative is that we stop ourselves from finishing. And there is that joke in the quilting world where we all have all these unfinished quilting projects. And some of that is because we have this squirrel syndrome where there's just too many things that we want to make and not enough time. But there will be some times when we didn't finish because there was something that happened in the process of that where we thought what we were doing wasn't good enough. And so we didn't finish it. And that is the bit that I try to avoid in my own sewing room, and that I hope that you can try to avoid in yours as well. Another way that stressing about our quilts can be good is that it's part of the learning process. I actually got stressed recently during this past quilt along, not because of my own quilts, but because I heard a couple of comments from folk who were new to foundation paper piecing in Scrap Club talking about struggles they had had. And so I was sitting there replying, oh, I'm sorry, maybe I didn't explain it right, whatever. And they were like, well, actually, I'm just learning something new, and so this is just part of the learning process. And I was like, oh, yeah, no, that's true. And I think we all know that when we're learning something new, it's not going to be easy straight away. And no matter how many tips you get from whoever, me or anyone else, there's still going to be a learning curve. And so there's going to be a little bit of stress or whatever when you're learning it. But the more you try and the more you find out what works for you, the easier it's going to get. If we never saw something we didn't like in our quilt and then figure out what it was and change it, then our quilts would never kind of evolve. I'm not going to say improve because that's subjective, right? But you would always be making the same quilt you made at the beginning. That aspect where it's like, I liked that, but I think I would have liked it better if, that makes you try something different next time. Is that stress or is it just learning, right? So I try not to put a negative connotation on that kind of stress either. That is just me learning what I like, growing, improving. So what I want to leave you with today is just to reiterate that obviously those negative "you're not good enough" voices are not real. They're not real people. And even if they are, who cares? Because it's your quilt, it's your hobby, it's your sewing room. And so you don't want to let them steal the joy of sewing because they've got expectations that maybe you don't agree with, and you don't have to agree with them. Second, I want to leave you with, it's okay to care about your quilts. It's okay to stress or consider or think, or whatever word you want to use, about the craft that you are spending your time and your hard-earned money on. Of course you're going to want to think about it. I don't know about anybody else, but when I'm telling you not to stress, what I mean is don't let it stop you from sewing, okay? If it's stopping you from sewing, that's the bad stress. We need to stop. We need to reframe it. We need to think about where it's coming from, and then we need to move on. if you're still sewing and you're still mostly enjoying it, even if you have a few moments of tearing your hair out at things that don't go the way you wanted, then that's fine. It's okay to care about what you're making. And in fact, you should. If you don't care, why are you making it in the first place? Now, sometimes with my videos, the best pearls of wisdom come from folk in the comments. So if anything in this video has chimed with you, please do drop a comment. Let me know how you reframe those negative voices in your own head and don't let them stop you sewing. And maybe give us some examples of times when focusing on quilting and sewing has helped you to feel better, helped you to not stress about things in the real world, or even help you to process emotions and heal from bad things that have happened in your life. Because I know that that is part of the beauty of quilting and what it can do for folk. So if you stayed all the way to the end, thanks so much for spending time with me. If you've not subscribed to the channel, I hope you'll consider it, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.